Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining this session at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, and it's good to see you all again. Today's topic is analysis and assessment of US APEC Summit. And through our insightful and thought-provoking discussion, we will deep into the analysis and assessment of this monumental event. We are honored to have the esteemed speakers from the region. And Edmund will introduce them in a short while. As we know that APEC is a group, intergovernmental forum of 21 emerging economies, and it was started or founded in 30 years ago in 1989, at the time of the senior Bush administrations, and it's a United States foreign policy strategy towards the Asia Pacific, though it's totally talks about economic and the prosperity of the region. So at this here hosted in California in San Francisco, it marks the third time when the United States hosted it after the Blake Island and the Honolulu in Hawaii. So apart from this US APEC summit, there has a lot happened in this meeting. On the sidelines of the US APEC summit, we noticed that Biden and Xi meeting was the top priority for both the administrations, and there are some developments in the relation between the China and the United States, and other prominent leaders were present there. So let's dig it more with the lens of the economic prosperity and the growth, including the bilateral and multilateral arrangement of the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. So now I would without further ado, I would like to invite Edmund Hurty. He is the moderator of this session. Edmund, over to you, please.
Yes, hello. We'll be introducing the speakers here. First is Colonel Jeffrey Holman. He's the Chief of Mission Assurance Division at the headquarters of the United States Indo-Pacific Command. As the J-34, he is responsible for establishing policies and procedures to implement anti-terrorism, critical infrastructure protection, and performance, readiness, and integration across the Asia-Pacific region, which is focused on enabling the Department of Defense activities to mitigate risk to personnel and resources engaged in full spectrum military operations. We also have Dr. Hanmin Yao, who is an associate professor at the National Defense University in Taiwan. He received his PhD from the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales, United Kingdom. His research investigates the intermingled relationships between national security policy, international relations, and technologies. He's contributed book chapters and journal articles on middle power responses to American and Chinese strategies in the Indo-Pacific, very relevant today, and Taiwan's coordination with Japan and US strategy towards Taiwan's defense, a subject on which he spoke at the consortium's 2022 conference. We also have Captain Sarabjit Parmar. Captain Parmar was commissioned in the Indian Navy in July of 1987 and retired in June of this year. He was part of the Indian Navy's strategic apex level offices, where, as part of the core team, he helped publish the Indian Navy's unclassified maritime security strategy document in 2015. As part of that assignment, he also carried out regional maritime assessments and completed the doctrine development plan. Prior to his retirement, he was the executive director and senior fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, and his areas of research are national and maritime strategy and security-related aspects in the Indo-Pacific, piracy, HADR, and international maritime law, with a focus on lawfare. And then I'm just a master's student at Georgetown University studying security studies. And with that, we're ready to go to the panelists to open up conversation. They have about 15 minutes each to introduce their views on the summit that just happened, anything that's particularly noteworthy to them that they thought is worth drawing out or particularly significant for the region. Colonel Holman, if we could begin with you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. As always, it's an honor to be here with you all and share views on important and historical moments here in the Indo-Pacific. As a disclaimer, as I always say, although I'm a member of the Department of Defense, the views that I'm going to express today are my own and do not reflect the views of my command, and all of the information that I'm going to present is from unclassified and open sources. I find it interesting that a forum that is dedicated to economic cooperation and trade relations was quickly overshadowed by the long-awaited meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And what was perhaps the biggest development that came out of that meeting was the agreement to resume mill-to-mill communications. So I've decided to kind of focus on that. Being a member of the Department of Defense and U.S. Indo-PACOM, I found that to be probably one of the biggest wins for both sides, because obviously both sides have a vested interest in ensuring that communications remain open in an effort to avoid miscalculation. On that note, American historian and author Barbara Tuchman is famous for saying, "War is the unfolding of miscalculations." And I think we can all agree that a lack of communication can increase the opportunity for miscalculation and therefore increase the opportunity for conflict. So hotlines in the name of national defense and international relations are nothing new. Our earliest and most prominent use of them goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where standard and lengthy diplomatic messages almost contributed to an all-out nuclear war. It's easy to see how a lack of timely and clear communications can lead decision makers to jump to the wrong conclusions and misinterpret adversary intentions. In the case of our relationship with China, a similar hotline was set up back in 2008 between the DoD and the Zhonghanhai Telecommunications Directorate, which had the discretion on whether to forward the call to the Foreign Affairs Office at the Department of their Department of Defense or the PLA's command headquarters in Beijing. So already we see this version of a hotline has a few more middlemen, with a reflection of China's committee-style governance, where whomever answers the phone will have to take a message and get back to you, if they get back to you at all. The actual utility of the hotline has been debated for years, with criticisms surrounding China's penchant for cutting off the hotline in protest against U.S. actions, such as Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, or in response to our decision to shoot down their spy balloon. At other times, the line would just ring and ring with no one picking up. So getting back to why a hotline or open line of communication is so critically important, the PRC and PLA have a bad habit of getting aggressive on the peripheries of their air and maritime space. Case in point, the 2001 collision of a U.S. EP-3 surveillance aircraft and a Chinese J-8 fighter south of Hainan Island, which resulted in the death of the J-8 pilot and emergency landing and detention of the U.S. EP-3 crew. In more recent times, the PLA Air Force and Navy have lased, water cannoned, chaffed, sonared, buzzed and rammed Philippine, Australian, Canadian, and U.S. aircraft and ships, all operating in international airspace or waters in accordance with international law. This type of unsafe and unprofessional behavior has created a very high-risk operating environment where the PRC seeks to intimidate and coerce others who they feel impinge upon their sovereignty or area of influence. The scariest clashes have been with the Philippine Coast Guard, who refuses to back down in the face of PRC aggression surrounding overlapping claims in the South China Sea, particularly around the Second Thomas Shoal. The recent announcement that the U.S. will conduct joint patrols with the Philippines will certainly raise the stakes and the opportunity for conflict. Circling back to the APEC, the issues, of course, impact more than just military interactions. As the world's two largest economies, such a hotline could be used by presidents, diplomats, generals, and other high-level government officials to diffuse tensions across the spectrum of geopolitical relations. So in conclusion on this particular topic, crisis communications are a critical guardrail intended to provide an off-ramp and de-escalate a situation that could easily spiral into armed conflict. Whether or not they pick up the phone has yet to be seen. Thanks again for the opportunity to present on this particular topic. I invite any particular questions or conversations in how this fits in with the greater APEC summit. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Holman. And we will definitely circle back and see if the panelists want to follow up with additional questions on that. In the meantime, Dr. Yao, would you like to make your opening remarks?
Okay, thank you, Edmond, and thank you, Colonel Holman. Thank you for just freshen up the purpose of the APEC. And it's very interesting that, first thing I need to say, I rely most of the information coming from the secondary sources, because there are a lot of things going on in the closed door. And I guess most of us can grasp upon the information from the opening remark and also the news press event after the meeting by Biden, and also the talk by Xi Jinping in the event that's organized by the National Committee of the Sino-US Relations. So I'm being also investigating the information and the conversation in the Chinese media, in particular what has been discussed. So this is like I try to do the comparison between what I saw from the Western media and what I also observed from the Chinese domain. The first thing I noticed is like there are a lot of conversation in the Chinese media talking about this would be similar to Jiang Zemin's visit to Seattle in 1993 APEC. Given that prior to 1993, China was under severe sanctions from the West due to the Tiananmen Square. So it looks like the Chinese media has been putting the effort, try to portray this visit would be like another very important event for the Chinese history. But somehow the conversation, as Colonel Holman succinctly summarized, the major agreement has been met in terms of establish some kind of hotline over the dialogue in order to avoid any kind of misperception or miscalculation. And ironically, there was the exact conversation that Xi and Biden discussed 1 year prior when they were in Bali. So on the other way, there was also the conversation saying that basically we are, we kind of haven't achieved anything for the past year. And now we just, start from the exact beginning, the base from last year during G20 Bali meeting. Now, this is the general sentiment observed from the Chinese media. But I think there are also 4 things we can observe this time, at least from my perspective. Maybe we can re-underline. The first thing is about the way Xi presents himself in front of the West. We obviously understand before we have been talking about wolf warrior diplomacy, but by observing the way he talk, the way he spoke, and I discovered he kind of toned down his rhetoric and try to promote the sentiment of dialogues and engagement. And he talked a lot about President Joe Biden when he was vice president 12 years ago, and then the good history between China and US. And I think in his talk, the evening talk organized by the National Committee of the Sino-US relation, he also talked about the panda. So he's conducting a little bit panda diplomacy. So the first thing, diplomatically, I would say, China try to create some kind of friendly atmosphere in terms of its engagement with the US. Now, the second thing, APEC, its purpose is economic. And if everyone is observing what's happening right now in China, certainly China's economy is not performing too well. Given they are amid of the real estate crisis, I probably won't say crisis, or downturn, and there's also a negative net flow of the foreign direct investment to China. So obviously, I can understand this. The purpose of this meeting is also about business. So a lot of time, the target audience for Xi Jinping is to the American enterprises. He tried to encourage them continue to invest in US. And given that we see a lot of countries or enterprises, they decided to realign their supply chains either to Vietnam, to Asian country, or to somewhere that's not in the middle of this competition. So what I saw is the second message is about economic. Now, the third one, certainly, Colonel Holman mentioned a lot about the military aspect. And I think Biden has been trying to make sure US and China will be in a relationship of competition, but within some kind of guardrails. So there's an agreement to reestablish the hotline, the dialogue. But certainly, Colonel Holman also pointed out the military is run by the Central Military Commission, and that's by the Chinese Communist Party, where this hotline is going to. In China, the foreign minister is like a diplomatic office for the military. So whoever is in a position to pick up the phone, does he has the capacity actually to respond to any kind of situation, or it will be something symbolic. Certainly, that would require us to keep follow. So these are three important things I watch. But the fourth thing, and I think I also want to mention, is in the evening talk by Xi Jinping in the National Committee of the Sino-US relation, he also emphasized the uniqueness, the exceptionalism of the Chinese political system. He tried to emphasize the need for Western country to respect the unique historical development, and the nature of the society, without interfering Chinese political system. And he also mentioned about three very important initiatives. One is the global development initiatives, and second one is global security initiative, and third one is the global civilization initiatives. So I think while China has been trying to achieve some friendly diplomatic image, attract more business investment, try to respond to US requests about the need of the dialogue. China also put into the effort to create an image to justify its political system and uniqueness, and certainly to create some kind of the discourse internationally. And maybe I think the target audience will be the global South. So these are four things I observe, in comparison what has been saying and what I read. Now, I also want to point out there was no joint statement by two governments. So US issue, the White House issue its own readout, and China Xinhua News Agency also issue its own readout. So I did a little bit comparison. I discovered there are probably four things I also want to mention. The first one is probably the issue of Taiwan. if you follow the conversation between Xi and Biden, you didn't see any kind of harsh rhetoric from Xi in terms of his position. And Biden also expressed clearly that Biden will respect the U.S., our one China policy, as I quote from the speech. But I checked Xinhua News Agency, and I think Xinhua News Agency's rundown is more strong. It says that China requests U.S. to stop arming Taiwan, to support the reunification of the China. And the other quote would be, China will eventually unify Taiwan, and Taiwan will return to the motherland. So these are very strong words from the Xinhua News Agency. So the reason I say they are in Chinese, I'm saying that, it's obviously they are focusing on domestic audience. So there's a nuances here. So this is the first one different. And obviously from the Biden side, from the White House readout, the only thing about is U.S. hasn't taken any position about Taiwan's future, but we have our own one China policy. We want it to be peaceful and stable. That's what I saw. That's number one, the discrepancy between the Chinese version and the English version, or the Chinese real and American real. Now the second one, I think in terms of the global security, Biden's talked quite a lot about Ukrainian, Israeli, Hamas, and request China to show up more responsibility. But China didn't mention anything in particular. He didn't give any commitment in his Chinese readout. And I think if everyone is following past development right now, I think there's a European foreign minister delegation visiting Beijing just right now, talking about they certainly call for international community support for the two-state solutions. Certainly, these things will not just happen this week. So maybe this is the reason they didn't actually say anything in particular to Biden's request, because they understand this will happen simultaneously. So this is the second thing I noticed. Now the third one, in the Chinese, in Chinese readout from Xinhua News Agency, Xi Jinping is very unsatisfied with the sanction put upon by the US regarding the semiconductor technologies and the ICT industry. So it looks like they use more stronger word. They say such kind of practice by US is to unfairly limit the prosperity of the Chinese people and the future development of the Chinese enterprise. It will be considered as an unfair, unjustified, and discriminating practice. So that will be something I saw from the Xinhua News Agency. Now, certainly this is from the Chinese perspective. And from Biden's perspective, Biden certainly believes this is a security issue, national security issue. So obviously there's a disagreement. Now the last one will be about human rights. Obviously, nothing has been mentioned in Xinhua News Agency's release of the news brief. Given Xi Jinping requests China to respect the human rights in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghur, but none of this has been described or even touched upon in the Xinhua News Agency's news brief. Well, though these are 4 observations from my own, and the other are 4 discrepancy I observed between the English media and the Chinese media, and I hope this will facilitate a more diversified conversation later. Okay, back to you, Emma.
Yeah, you certainly gave us a lot of things to be able to dialogue about shortly here. Captain Farmar, ready for your introductory remarks as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to be focusing on how India and the APEC, how that sort of matrix works out, since we're not a member of the APEC. But before that, I'd just like to comment on a few things which Colonel Holman and Dr. Yao had mentioned. It's one is on the hotline issue. We've got a hotline with Pakistan for God knows how many years. Not that it has stopped any conflict, but your point is very valid. Is that it all depends if the other side is going to pick up the phone, and more importantly, who picks up the phone. If you remember, in the Cold War, there's always a question as to who's in charge. So that's something that may, resonate on the ongoing hotline communications and mill to mill. Although it's a welcome step, especially since it was knocked out after the visit to Taiwan by I'm forgetting the lady's name right now. So my apologies for that. That's one. The other issue is on Taiwan. Dr. Yao had mentioned a lot of valid points, and although she has been very clear to told the U.S. to stop harming Taiwan, but he's also said that the reunification is unstoppable. And there are news reports that say that senior U.S. military officials have said that China will invade Taiwan by 2027. Now that's you can never give a year to such a thing, first of all, and this may be some speculation that has come about it. But the fact is that South China Sea is on fire, and all the incidences that Colonel Holman has mentioned, starting from the collision between the Chinese fighter and the U.S. EPA. Remember, the Chinese did lose the pilot at that point in time. So things don't necessarily pan out the way you want to do it, especially even if the leaders meet on the side. And 4 hours is a long time conversation. And do remember that immediately on the completion of the summit, Biden did mention that did comment on Xi's dictatorship leadership and the governance on that, which didn't go down well with the Chinese. So therefore, I really don't know. And the video recording showed that Blinken was taken aback, I think, by what Biden had to say at that point in time, and the look on his face obviously perhaps undermined the whole talks that took place on the sidelines in San Francisco. But with that, I'll just get back to what I have been charged with. So, of course, back to APEC. It's trade and economic issues, number one. And I think most probably this summit got hijacked by other issues which are resonating around the world, which included, of course, China, South China Sea. There would have been some sort of a discussion, even I suppose, on Ukraine and perhaps on West Asia, but that's something that is left for a later date. And getting back to the importance of APEC and India, and it's important for India to understand that it needs to gun for a membership. APEC accounts for the figure is 62% of the global GDP and nearly half the global trade. There are 21 members, and when you look at it, more than half are in the Indo-Pacific, and these nations account for 2.9 billion people. And if you add India's population, then you're looking at a huge increase in the number of people involved. The economies will jump, and global GDP will go up, and global trade will also increase. And the theme is important of APEC, that is creating a resilient and sustainable future for all, which was the theme for this year's summit, and it sort of converges with India's policy of SAGA, security and growth for all in the region. So there is a lot of convergences that you see. And although we may have put up a request to become a part of the grouping in 1991, especially when when the Indian economy was open and liberalized, started and opened the Indian markets, but there has been some sort of opposition to India's joining, and I'll just cover a few points. And one of them is the that even though the reforms were in place, it sort of supported, protectionist instincts, and there's a reason for that, and that I'll cover in a little bit later when it comes to the domestic markets. And of course, there was a freeze which has been put in place, but I mean, it's open to the APEC members to decide whether they want India on board or not. And just like to mention that way back in 2015 January, when Obama and Narendra Modi signed the US India Joint Strategic Vision for the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, there was a mention of welcoming India's interest in joining the APEC forum. But it's not that India stopped its investments. We've been expanding trade and investment ties with the region since the early 2000s. Examples I can give you are the India ASEAN FTA and the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreements with Singapore and Malaysia. Though, of course, the figures have another story to tell, and there is also a lot of progress that can be made. And essentially, the reading is that India is also interested in APEC as it is a grouping instead of a trade agreement with binding commitments. And do remember, APEC follows a consensus approach. So, what are the advantages for India? And let me bat on that a little bit. One is, because it's several advantages that one can look at. One is that it will promote closer economic relations, facilitate trade, investment flows, and provide major access to major economies, which slowly is opening, but there are certain limitations. And of course, it would boost India's exports, attract a lot of foreign direct investment, and support domestic initiatives like the Make in India or the Atmanirbhar. We have seen progress that the US has now given the approval to start manufacturing engines for India's indigenous aircraft, which is a big boost insofar as aircraft production is concerned. And we are also looking at maybe exporting such aircraft. And of course, in the recent Dubai Air Show, we did showcase one of the Tejas light combat aircraft. So that's a positive step towards, sort of enhancing economic integration. But then an alignment with APEC, there are certain issues. But first, India needs to look at simplifying and harmonizing trade procedures and regulation. And of course, this will lead to adoption of best practices, streamline trade processes, and reduce transaction costs. And this, I think, is something that we need to look at seriously. And there are certain lessons that we can learn when we engage with the APEC with APEC members. One is the unilateralism aspect, where members voluntarily propose trade liberalization measures without formal negotiations, and therefore the goes back to the certain lessons that can be learned and the methodology that perhaps India can adopt when it comes to changing its national policies. More importantly, as I said, it could facilitate technology transfer in key sectors for India. IT is one. We're a big IT hub ourselves. We can just keep growing on that. Pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, renewable energy, and manufacturing. And this access to new technologies could enhance India's competitiveness and productivity while promoting knowledge sharing and capacity building among APEC members. And we've come a long way. We have a lot of startups that have gained traction in India that are looking at certain issues, and that is something I will cover in my next line. Is that the other biggest gain India would have is access to APEC resources, expertise, some I've mentioned earlier, including the Business Advisory Council, which is quite influential in world trade and investments. And India would be able to participate in discussions on topics aligned with its ongoing development interests, whether it's automation or micro, small, and medium enterprises, and especially women's economic participation, which has got a lot of thrust, especially the last two. That is the MSME, where we have a lot of these, a lot of younger people are floating companies. They're jumping into the fray. One example I can give you is unmanned aircraft, drones. Got a lot of companies that have entered. A lot of them are listed in the stock exchange of India. A lot of people are making money investing in it. And I don't like stocks because for certain personal reason, but if you are interested, perhaps you can look at Indian drone companies, and all the best with that. Don't take it as an internal trip, and don't blame me if you go for any losses in that issue out there. There are certain advantages that come out, that the biggest advantage also comes is that the APEC membership would support India's Act East policy, Look West policy, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, all under Sagar, rubric of Sagar. As I said, as APEC combines political deliberations among leaders with working level economic task forces and technical groups, which otherwise we would not have access to. Um, what are the advantages for the APEC members? What I mentioned above also would have a reciprocatory note when you engage with India and the other countries. One big thing is providing increased access to India's labor force, and there is almost a culmination of an MOU, and I'd like Dr. Yao's comments on it, that we may look at sending around 100,000 what do you call skilled workforce to Taiwan. That is something that I think has been overdue for a very long time. And this again would aid, industry to industry cooperation. And especially, I think we should look at the chips issue quite seriously on this. And perhaps we can have an alternate market going. And apart from that, there are expanding consumer markets and creating more investment opportunities. But there are certain concerns that need to be kept in mind and addressed. First of all, India would need to make significant domestic reforms and adjustments to adhere to the APEC standards, regulations, and this may be challenging in the short run due to domestic politics. And of course, do remember that a lot of our small and or medium enterprises would need to stand up to the challenges, and there is always the fear that they would have to shut down in the face of maybe more competition. And I think the more stronger resilience of the similar markets in the APEC member nations. So that is something that the government have had to do. And do remember, we are due for elections in February next year. I don't think this present government would like to do anything drastic that will sort of lose the vote count. So if anything has to happen, it will happen after February, and then it depends which government comes into in power at that point in time. And this has also been the concern with the FTAs and other economic groupings. So you realize that India has steered away from signing on the dotted line on most of the cases, whether it's TTP, RCEP, etc. Even on the APEF, it's just agreed to one aspect and not, those issues are there, and the domestic policies did. I mean, it does rule the roost in India as far as all this is concerned. The other concern is that there's an apprehension that India's APEC membership could lead to a representation favoring Asia over other countries or over other regional countries. And as there are we already have two big growing economies present as China and Japan. And if India jumps to number three, then can you imagine the sort of imbalance that may come through? So that's an apprehension which I think can be addressed with much more deliberations. And of course, if India does become an APEC member, then we would need to balance the interests and priorities of other regional groupings of which it is a member. Three examples I can give is IORA, BIMSTEC, and SARC. Not that SARC has any big stay, but when it comes to sort of a narrative or a discussion, even redundant groupings become important. So IORA and BIMSTEC would be two groupings where India would have to balance its approach. And do remember also, we are in a little bit of a sort of a sticky situation here with Maldives asking India to remove all its military personnel. And if China is going to fill that void, then perhaps we are looking at a bigger sort of instability, not only in security issues in the Indian Ocean region, but also perhaps economic. And that's where should US will also have to jump into the fray, because a lot of issues will emerge from that. And but let's see where that goes. Let's see in which direction the new Maldives president takes the nation in over a way. And the other issue is that India's inability to perhaps or reluctance to agree to certain liberalization agendas could slow down the manner in which APEC progresses, especially as I mentioned earlier, that it is a consensus-based nature approach that APEC follows. But on the brighter side, India's joining of APEC would aid greater economic integration of the Indo-Pacific, especially when emerging trade regimes could create gaps between standards and policies adopted by their members and those pursued by non-members. And therefore, by joining APEC, India could play a constructive role by helping bridge such gaps, because it's managed to balance its engagement with economies despite having a limited number of FTAs or such economic agreements signed with various nations. It's limited our economy, but in the larger picture, it does also produce certain results. So there are certain steps that have been identified or are out there in the open for a very long time that may help India address concerns regarding its membership. One is India's domestic economic or trade policies, which I've already mentioned. And some examples are goods and service taxes or GST, which we have implemented, or land and labor reforms, which are which have had very slow progress and sends a stronger signal of greater market opening that needs to be worked upon. An accelerated effort to improve the ease of doing business for both foreign and domestic firms. A lot of private companies and a lot of even governments say that uh, the nature of doing business with India, whether it's with the government or private enterprising, is a painful process due to the policy. So there needs to be a tweaking of a combination of both insofar as these are concerned. Um, then, of course, I've said this, I'll just repeat it again, is indication of India's willingness to engage constructively in negotiations, especially such as, bilateral investment treaties. India is a bit chary of bits, but this is, again, as I said, it is a grouping. And more importantly, it would require a vigorous diplomatic effort by India and key APEC members that support India's bid for them to join. I mean, it can't be a sort of an approach where nations are saying, yes, that we agree that India should have permanent membership of the UN Security Council, but you need to do much more than just certain lip service. Um, Last point is perhaps it's time to rename APEC as IPEC, the Indo-Pacific, replace Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, for the simple reason that it sounds more inclusive than exclusive. So if you go by the traditional definition of what Asia Pacific was in the earlier days before Indo-Pacific became the flavor of the decade, was that it sort of looked only at areas east of Malacca Strait. You need to include the western part of the Malacca Strait. So perhaps a changing of a name from APEC to IPEC could perhaps change the manner in which nations look at APEC and how APEC looks at the world. And with that, I'll stop. And if there are any questions or any other issues that we'd like to discuss, I'm open to them. Thank you so much.
On here. Before I ask any questions myself, do you guys want to, do the panelists want to dialogue with each other at all? Do you have any questions for each other, or any clarifications or potential areas of agreement or disagreement to highlight? And that is an open forum for any of you to speak up at this point if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Sarabjit. That's a very interesting point. You made some of those points, but I would like just to mention here that we already have IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, with the 14 countries partner, and at the side of the APEC meeting, there was the IPEF meeting too. And again, there is what's the India's lack of interest? Should we say like that, or like the India's more openness? We need that where the trade pillar is, there is no progress on the trade pillar except the other three pillars. So that is where you mentioned that how India can open more itself from the market side and from the domestic, looking at the demographic dividend. And so IPEF is already there with the 14 countries or partners there. And Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, because it's like a 3 decades old and intergovernmental forum, and have its own relevance. I would say, because Chile is there, Mexico is there, because these countries doesn't count in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Like they don't count in Indian Ocean region. So some of the countries, though Canada comes in both, but Canada is not part of the IPEF member. So there is some sort of like, I would take more on when the discussion will go further on why India opted out from the CPTPP and RCEP, and why the India is not like going good on the multilateral alignments, rather than India is doing good on the bilateral sides when it comes with the India-Indonesia talks, or the economic side of the Southeast Asian country, like you mentioned in the Look East and Act East policy. So whenever like we have a kind of discussions from the Southeast Asian experts and panelists, I always hear this, that India should do more in this in terms of the economy, to open the economy, being the largest in the population and the largest country in the Indian, and maybe in the Indo-Pacific, like after China.
So that I agree with you. So if I may just give you my little viewpoint on this, it's more of a cosmetic change. I mean, PACOM has become Indo-PACOM. It's not that the Indo-PACOM working environment or the thing has changed. It's what I said was, you have IPEF, I agree. And as far as India is concerned, the Indo-Pacific stretches up to the western coast of the Americas. And if Canada, which can be considered on the western coast of the Americas, can come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy, this is an interesting point to bring up. In most of our discussions, even in Asia Pacific, if you are including, South American countries like Peru and all that, they are all obviously a part of the Indo-Pacific. And to my mind, it's a very neglected region in a way. So I'm just saying it's just a cosmetic change. It sounds better, because Asia Pacific is now, it's a little aged, it's redundant, it requires a relook. It's whether I decide to wear an orange shirt and look brighter, it doesn't matter. I will still be Sarabjit as it is. So it's just a cosmetic change. It's in with the times. It's people look at it differently. So that was the point I was making.
Yeah, I've got a comment that I'd like to make on Honmen's remarks, and that has to do with the kind of lack of the discussion on the human rights and fair labor practices aspect of this conference. Certainly, when you're talking economics, when you're talking trade, you can't talk about those things without discussing you know, the prosperity of the people that are creating the goods that are, you know, contributing to trade in these economies. And so I think, you know, the U.S. Has tried to lead in that arena, and certainly we have our own, you know, issues to deal with when it comes to, you know, fair trade and fair labor. But I think, you know, just focusing on the dollars and the economies themselves, and neglecting, you know, the labor conditions, which, you know, in a lot of developing countries can disadvantage, you know, women, children, and others. I think that's important to keep that in the forefront, and that if we're going to have a forum that's talking about economic cooperation, that becomes or remains a key and central aspect of the discussions. Thanks.
Okay, I say I should also pitch in. Yeah, certainly I think for economy, you need to talk about ESG, and you also need to talk about the corporate responsibility, and all these things are very important. And I think certainly it's very interesting that APEC is an economy forum, and then we talk more about military. And then it's also remind me about you talk about Hanai. The Hanai was invented during the height of Cold War. People feel the need to actually cool the temperature down. And for me, I sense that from US side, US understand there's a practical need actually to manage such kind of competition. But when I'm thinking about this, I also think about it's also very interesting. Remember when Xi Jinping came to power in year 2012, he talked to Obama, saying that this is you know a new type of the a great power relations or great country relations, you know, and back then he say the Pacific Ocean is big enough for two countries. But this time he's saying the world is big enough for two countries. So this is also something, you know, make me think exactly the mindset is different. You know, very interesting. Now, to continue the economic dialogue, although I'm not a really economic expert, but I also want to say we have been able to pay attention about the negative net flow of the foreign direct investment to China. And a lot of people, well, China certainly would say this is because of the democratic camps or West. They are conducting, China would say, the so-called de-risking policy. But I would say de-risking policy would act out of the agency of the government. But whether enterprises or corporate who follow that policy is certainly a different matter. So I would say there are three types of agency over here. Now the agency of the US or the West and the Europe, and the agency of the corporates. But there's also the agency of China. I think China is actually making the region unsafe. So when this Western company feel it's an unsafe environment, maybe it's not actually the only agency coming from the West or the US, which is encouraging de-risking and make them make a decision to realign their supply chain to other countries. It's simply a basic cost-effect calculation or risk mitigation decision. While they are sensing the threat by the aggressive military activity conducted by China in the East China Sea, over Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea. Certainly they worry any conflict occur to the region is not only creating the problem for Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, but also create a problem for the most prosperous region in the southeast coast of China. And you, if you are the CEO of a company, you certainly make a decision, and maybe it would be the better decision for you to diversify your production basis. And this is even to say, under China's national security law, anti-spying law, Western consultant companies that will not be able to collect all this public information in China in order to fulfill their due diligence commitment, making sure Western company will be able to understand exactly what's happening on the ground before they make a decision to invest. Certainly, these are all factors that create this kind of situation. So I would say a lot of time is not just about the West, the decision of the company, is also China by itself, how as a state, China as a state, how they behave to facilitate a better environment for business activity. Now, this will come in to talk about the earlier conversation between APEC and IPEF. Obviously, after Second World War, we tried to create a norm to depoliticize economic activity. But nowadays, economic activity has been politicized. Well, it's hard to say who showed the more responsibility. Certainly, in this talk, APEC, China is accusing US, using economy unfairly. But we should also remember China, put on some kind of export control of its rare earth mineral toward Japan during the East China Sea, conflict, and also the deployment of THAAD in Korea Peninsula. So obviously, it takes two to dance. So I would say, while we understand their certainly now, they are concerned about national security. So US conducting this policy. But I think likewise, very often, China will use its economic power as the extension of its coerced diplomacy and request other countries to behave, follow its own term. So this is something we need to make clear to China, to think about all this economic fragmentation. Some people will very pessimistically say it's an anti-globalization. It's actually result also part of the China's making. So I think this is something I want to say. Now, I would like to see APEC become Indo-Pacific PEC, but we should also remember IPEC doesn't include Taiwan. And this goes back to the point about the politicizing economic activities. And I certainly agree with Sarojit's comment about, India should be allowed to join the APEC, but there's a historical moment. But I never believe any concept would be like a time capsule. You transcend time and space, become some kind of the eternal truth. Certainly, we need to adjust, and we need to adjust it along with the time and space. So what I see is like it would be hard to do it like multilateral. But if we can take small step, I want to emphasize that actually there's a bilateral investment agreement between India and Taiwan. So we are making a small step, one step forward. Now, next step will be for like my countries, in particular India, maybe to sign some kind of free trade agreement with Taiwan. Not just thinking about, we certainly, the conversation about, allowing 100,000 Indian workers coming to Taiwan. But I think if we really want to change the regional situation, dialogue and economic exchange will also be very important element of that. So this is my observation and my comment to continue the economic conversation. But really enjoy Colonel Holman, your comment, and also Sarojit, your comment about the economy cooperation. So I don't know who I should pass to. Back to you, Edmund. Given
Dr.
that you
Yao,
are the moderator.
Yeah, Dr. Yao, I just want to make a brief comment here. Like you mentioned that Taiwan is there in the APEC, right? So, but Hong Kong is also there. So it's not. It's like they say that it's a totally economic forum. They don't because they and the leaders was not happy to comment on any kind of conflict in the Middle East or the Russia-Ukraine. So like this, I'm not sure. I will check it again because I saw the name there. In the member countries of APEC, it was there Chinese Taiwan, Chinese Hong Kong.
It's there.
So
Yeah. You're
so-
asking Taiwan. You know, we talk about there are different kind of layer of relationship. So economic relationship, you know, the multilateral one is regulated by World Trade Organization. So Taiwan and China both joined World Trade Organization in year 2001. Now you are talking about the exact name. I think for the World Trade Organization, it's called Taiwan Penghu module. It's like a economic custom, I think custom territory, something like that, you know, because in the economic domain, as long as you are an economic entity, you can you have the ability to act. So Taiwan is the member of the APEC. Now, the official name for Taiwan's membership for APEC, I didn't actually, I don't remember, but I think it probably would be like something like Chinese Taipei, something like that. You know, it'll be long ago. Now, the decision was made back then because we were thinking about the practical dialogue is more important than political argument. But our, you know, I would say, you know, we see in this way, but China will see it differently. That would be something I would say, and that's why you heard my comment about I paying attention about what Xinhua News has been saying about China's attitude to the U.S. One China policy, and this is certainly something you know, for your information. But say internationally, a lot of time we focus on the diplomatic relationship, and certainly there's a debate always there. But after the Second World War, there was a consensus that we should depoliticize economic activity. But somehow, this consensus has been undermined, and that's also the reason China was invited to join World Trade Organization in year 2001. The West at the time was hoping by including China into the international economic order, they would be able to change China to follow the established international law, including opening up its market, become a full market economy. But somehow the size of China matter. It's not just the war could change China a little bit. China now is looking forward to change the world. So that's why in my earlier comment, I'm talking about the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. If you remember from year 2000 to 2010, everyone was only talking about China as an economic powerhouse. Since Xi Jinping came to power from 2012 onward, we've been talking about East China Sea conflict, island building in South China Sea. China become a military actor, security actor. Now, China is not satisfied, is want to set up a new standard for the international law. So that's why China proposed its Global Civilization Initiative. So what I said was like, you know, Global Development Initiative is like a continuation of its economic power. Global Security Initiative is its vision for the security order. Now we are talking about the Global Civilization Initiative. So obviously, you know, just to connect back into your comment, let you know, there was something, there was belief, there was vision, but unfortunately, you know, it's not working in the way the West was originally hoping for. So that's my comment, my response to your question. Back to you. Yeah.
Could I jump in case on covering of certain issues? Okay, let me look at the first one. You know, the GSI, which Dr. Yao has mentioned, when you read the white paper on the GSI by China, you wonder if there are two sets of government. One writes a very nice white paper, which is idealistic for world security, global security, but the actions on ground are actually in a totally different direction. So that sort of confuses people, and it'll be interesting. I'm going to go across this global civilization initiative and see what it has to say. Getting back to seabed mining, which was mentioned, you know, there's a paper I read, I think, a couple of days back by Foreign Policy. The China is actually looking at commercialization of seabed mining. One. So are we going to look at I think we're looking at a new arena of competition and possible conflict, and especially with the High Seas Treaty, which is out for signature. You know, the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, it's something that I think needs to be carefully looked at. And if I do remember, 20th September, the day it was opened, you had 67 nations who signed, but it requires 60 ratifications. India has not signed on 20th September. A very rare thing, I think. Otherwise, for UNCLOS, we signed on the first day. Took 14 years to ratify it, but that's a different story. So we need to say where this is going, especially where technology and everything else will be involved in this issue. A word on human rights. You know, it's a very sensitive issue, and I think the way we have seen human rights being bandied about and put on banners with the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, there is obviously an emerging different opinion on how, for whom are the human rights and how it works out on that aspect. But with that, I'll bring out a new term, and we had a discussion with certain quad fellows who visited India, and they came from 4 or 5 countries: US, Japan, you know, India, and we talked about modern slavery. And I don't know if you have come across that, but it's very interesting that when you read the reports on modern slavery, and this is where your bonded labor and everything comes in. I mean, certain countries have legislation. India's got legislation. How effective it is, I mean, that's a separate study to be carried out. But there's an interesting point that I came across, that who is more guilty? The nation that turns a blind eye to bonded labor, or the nation who imports goods that are made under bonded labor? So if there is certain trade regulations that enforce it, then I really don't know whether how much economics will go off, because there is an issue of the term is modern slavery, and we had a nice discussion on modern slavery in IUU fishing. China is one of the biggest culprits, but you know, it's just a gentle reminder that even the Spanish fishing fleets are still creating havoc the world over, especially around the western coast of Africa, even as we speak. So these are issues that need to be looked at more seriously, and I don't think the sort of APEC or any other economic forum is the right place. It has to be dealt with diplomatically and government to government. Then, of course, when national interest comes in, everything else is sort of put aside. So I thought I'd put these on the table. Thanks.
I want to ask kind of a broad question that gets at both what Dr. Yao has been talking about with the China's global vision and a different vision for the world than the current norms, and also then circle back to Captain Parmar's comments about India actually joining the forum, which is just that the forum, as it currently exists, its mission was to promote liberalization, and its mechanism was consensus. And it seems like both of these things are in short supply and countervailing to the spirit of the day, in the sense that economically, groups are shifting towards maybe the end of globalization is an overstatement for sure, but you know, the idea of the de-risking strategy that even South Korea and Japan are talking about, and the United States is certainly putting its export controls and the like. With that shift, the goal of uniform standards for all countries in the membership seems highly unrealistic at this point. And then there are just differing visions of even what constitutes valid economic zones, such as, you know, going back to Colonel Holman's discussion about the conflicts with the Philippine fishermen and other vessels in the South China Sea. It's like the question of whose territory is that even to exploit? Whose territory or who can have access to those resources? And so in light of that, I'm wondering what value the forum, and I'd like to get your comments on this, what value the forum itself has in the modern geopolitical climate and context that we're in. And Captain Parmar, I'd like to shift this to you first, because specifically for India, I wonder about, to the extent that APEC would be useful, and also to what extent it's necessary. Useful because one of the chief complaints for those parties who don't want to pick between China and the United States is just the United States is still not offering market access, whether it be through IPEF or for APEC members. It's not, that's been the chief complaint. And then secondly, India has made excellent moves, bilaterally speaking, to get what it actually wants in economic terms, such as its agreement with Taiwan to have the 100,000 workers go to Taiwan. And so if it's having success in bilateral negotiations and getting real economic concessions, and it could be a valuable partner even with the United States, Japan, South Korea, et cetera, in de-risking its supply chains out of China, and has real gains to be made there. What is the value in India saying we want to really push for membership in the cosmetic side of being part of the forum and renaming it, all of that? And that kind of question for India stems from that broader question about what value does the forum itself have, considering that, as we saw, it was completely overshadowed by even questions related to Israel and Gaza, which have little to do with the Pacific and little to do with economics. So that's, I guess, a big question to try to tackle there. But if you want to start on that first, Captain Parmar, and then we can kind of peel back to the other members on what the values of the forum and what its membership would entail.
Fair enough. I'll try to be as brief as possible. So the advantages for India and the other nations, I've already highlighted one, but there are two main issues that come out. One is, remember, this is a grouping with no legal binding. So whether you come to a consensus or don't come to a consensus, I don't think that would be a major issue. But the main thing that needs to be looked at is the acceptance of the trade regulations that are binding the APEC from day one of 1989, and the mechanisms that have flowed out from an understanding of these regulations or an acceptance of these regulations. So the question is that have these regulations, or the approach to the regulations and the mechanisms, have they sort of evolved over a period of time? 1989 is a long time back. Things have changed in the last one decade so tremendously. Is that has APEC kept up, or has kept pace with what is happening with the world over, and specifically with sub-regions of, since we're looking at the Asia Pacific, with various sub-regions of the region? That's one. The other thing is also that has APEC got overshadowed by the number of FTAs that are floating around? And IPEF framework is one, if I put it that way. TTP is another. RCEP is another. I don't know if a study has been carried out, but we worth to look at is there anything that is the issues that are divergent in all these understandings, and therefore under the rubric of APEC, since I said it's not legally binded, it is possible that nations may look at a certain bilateral method or even a trilateral method of engaging each other to ensure that their economic corridors and their investments and trade continue. So if APEC continues to provide that sort of an avenue, then I would say that yes, it still has some relevance. But if all nations are to imbibe it and get on with it, then perhaps it has a little, I'm just going out to limb here, is a little restricted value for what it was conceived for earlier. Just to give you an example, the UN is another international organization which is under fire many years, and there are certain reforms that have been suggested, but they've not been carried out. If you remember, many years ago, there was the Brahmi report that came out. I really don't know how many reforms the UN has adopted or even looked at. UN Security Council, expansion is one. So is it time that the APEC needs to have an internal audit, relook and see whether the functioning of the APEC needs a revision? Number one, do you need to be more flexible? And more importantly, that are you in touch with the times of today? And how are you looking at the future, possible future paths that can be followed? I think these are issues that need to be looked at. And of course, India will play its part, and India coming on board APEC, the growing economy, if we're going to be number 3, 5 in the next couple of years, and it does carry some weight. And how long can you ignore the size of a growing nation like India? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay,
Dr. Yap, you want to finish?
can I also offer a little bit comment? Because now we are talking about economy and there's economy argument. As I understand, after the end of World War II, and along at the end of the Cold War, the world was hoping to create some kind of, universal multilateral platform. And there's World Trade Organization, but it was created by 1995, if I don't remember, get the time right. But APEC was created way before that. So obviously there's a historical relationship over there. And when World Trade Organization was created, it was given some kind of mandate to create to act as a universal standard and to encourage free trade. But somehow it encountered problems. Hence, now most of the countries shift to focusing on either bilateral, so that'll be where the free trade agreement or bilateral investment agreement come in, because obviously, one-to-one would be easier to make agreement in comparison with all the members around the world, or the regionalization, and that's where we talk about the RCEP, CPTPP. But eventually, the goal is to promote free trade. So the free trade will be based on a non-discriminatory practice. So obviously, we can always argue whether APEC should be more inclusive or whether IPEF should be more inclusive. I guess I would say my argument would be like value would be like we should depoliticize economic activity, and that was the original intent. But somehow, the vision has been undermined, and it's happening right now because obviously, great powers are also seeing economic activity differently. So this is actually the value has been undermined, and because of that, I think Edmond mentioned about the term anti-globalization or deglobalization, and there's the kind of debate right now. But there's a compromise approach. It will be like before the free trade is based on the idea of the comparative advantage. Each country has its comparative advantage. Now, people are talking about we should do complementary advantage. So maybe you won't be create some kind of universal or multilateral platform, but we should start by focusing on, like my countries, and encouraging some kind of minilateralism. So that's what's happening right now. So I think IPEF and APEC, they have their unique position. And in particular for Taiwan, APEC is important because that's allowed Taiwan to participate, to represent itself internationally. As there are many other international value that's not accessible for Taiwan so far. So APEC would be very, very important. And given that, I think one of the other reasons why we are talking about security issue in an economy forum, that's because when you come to any security forum, under China's severe protest, Taiwan will not be able to be invited to the event. And the oxymoron is, while everyone is talking about the security over Taiwan's trade, one party has been discriminated by China's practice and without to make its opinion heard. And so this would make IPEC extremely important because it somehow serves as the bridge to be more inclusive in a relatively term in comparison with other platforms. So I guess, from Taiwan's perspective, I argue IPEC is still important. That'll be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
I see you're muted, Edmond.
Sorry, what? Oh, yes. Okay. So continuing on. Thank you for your comment on explaining Taiwan's perspective on why it's relevant and helpful for Taiwan. Thank you for that. Keeping with the theme though of now economics being viewed as more of a political question, like you mentioned before, more of a political issue. There have been, the United States brought out IPEF, which has been mentioned several times, but China has also its own, regional agreement that has allowed, its its own regional leadership and economic questions. And the United States, as no news to anyone here, sees this as a political move, even if it were more for economic reasons. And we see in terms of what agreements a country is part of and what its trading relationships with other countries are as about falling into one country's orbit or one country's block. They think in terms of in very block political terms. So my question then is, yes, thank you, Dr. Saxena. So my question on that then is that because one of the chief complaints from member states that have wanted to have greater economic relationships with the United States is the lack of market access. If the United States does not put greater market access on the table as part of its strategy to keep countries more in its orbit as opposed to out of China's economic orbit, does it have enough to offer? Or does it need to put greater market access on the table to have something to have enough to offer to make a compelling case for its own economic leadership in the region? And if any of you want to take that, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment on that. So certainly, I think it was disappointing that the U.S. was not able to unveil some proposals for the trade pillar at APEC. I think we've all read in the news that there was some congressional opposition to that, and so that prevented that from being rolled out. Hopefully, in the future, those things can be worked out. So for the moment, I think that's a bit of a bump in the road for the U.S. in that regard. But certainly, I think the rest of the world, when you talk about what China has to offer by way of economic, and trade agreements, there's also, a realization that what China has to offer comes with strings attached. Whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative and the some of the lending practices, that have been highlighted in recent years. Also, the way that China uses its trade relations to punish those who, are adopting policies or speaking out against the CCP. Those are a couple of examples of reasons why, China is not seen as, the only game in town or necessarily the best game in town. Thanks.
Well, I think I also add a little bit about Edmund's comment about whether U.S. is using its economy as potential leverage. I think certainly I would say U.S. worry about the security side. The security, in a sense, is not just simply about the military security. And that's why in this APEC conversation, as I remember, President Joe Biden say U.S. is going to compete with China fiercely, but they want to making sure this competition will not escalate as an uncontrolled conflict. And that's where the hotline coming. But I think from the Chinese media, earlier I mentioned about the point of the great power relations. I think in Xi Jinping's address in the evening, for the event I mentioned about, the event organized by the national community of the Sino-US relations, Xi Jinping made a comment talking about, China and US should not compete, should cooperate for the purpose of win-win. My sense is the definition of competitions are different in American language and in Chinese language. Obviously, US believe that both China and US can compete while talk, while communicate. And because we want to make sure we don't have any miscalculation or misperception. But China would see competition as some kind of conflict, equal to conflict as well. So China is always saying that we should have a good relationship and not the competition. And this will afford us a win-win situation. And so I guess this would be the fundamental, my sense that the different understanding or different position regarding to what we mean about competition. Now, I mentioned about fragmentation of the economic order. Obviously, China nowadays has been trying to create an alliance through its Belt Road Initiative with developing country, with Global South. And US, given US is still the biggest market, many democracies still rely on the US market. And that's why there seems to be a trend. There's a fragmentation between, economic entity, economic block, democracy block, and the, autocracy block or authoritarian block. And this has been also intensified by the Russo-Ukrainian war. So whether US economy as a leverage or not, I think it's already happening. And this is, as I say, not just because US want to do de-risking or the Euro want to do de-risking. It simply is also because China is taking other measures. That is not creating a friendly environment. And as any CEO of Western companies, you would make a decision that would make business sense and follow the business logic. So I think it's already happening right now. And so that's why I think it's important, as I mentioned, if it's really hard to create some kind of unilateral economic platform, like my country should invest more resources to create some kind of bilateral framework. So I'm really happy to see, as I mentioned, we have free trade agreement with India, and I think Taiwan is also working very hard with US to create some kind of economic framework. And hopefully we will be able to deepen this kind of relationship, in particular with India. Maybe we have free trade agreement with India as well. That will also something, I think that will ensure economic security and cooperation. Thank you.
Edmund, do I have time to push in a couple of pointers, or are we reached the end of the time?
And make your points there, and then I believe that means that we are at the end of the discussion. Dr. Sakana, is that correct? Okay. All right, yeah, so go ahead.
I'll just make it short and brief. And well, I'd love an FTA with Taiwan, Dr. Yao. No, there is a long-standing issue that we do not have enough scholars from India and Taiwan, and now perhaps it's a long-standing request by Taiwan. I mean, you want to understand China, the best people is the Taiwanese. You will understand China better, and that's an advantage nations can accrue from there, especially since English is also widely spoken in Taiwan as compared to China. There's one issue out there. There's an article I read by Robert Gates about US being a dysfunctional power recently. And there is a growing feeling, perhaps, that the US is stretched a bit too much. It's looking at Ukraine, looking at South China Sea, now it's looking at West Asia. And there are only that number of people who sit in a room and take decisions, and therefore they are a little bit stretched. And therefore, the ability to say better China economically, even though there are many engagement platforms, is a question that needs to be asked. Is that one is that do economic sanctions actually work, and how effective are they? Russia is a case in point where there have been economic sanctions, but Russia has found a sort of via media to move it out. And then, of course, getting back to national interest, one example is that the US still, I believe, I'm open to correction, it still imports a certain amount of uranium from Russia to run its nuclear power plants. I mean, that is the way economics works out, even if you have a security issue or you are, adversarial nations. Let's not fool ourselves. China is very steadfast in what it wants. So perhaps this meeting with Biden and whatever they discussed on the bylines of APEC, it could have emerged from the fact that West Asia is on fire and therefore China's BRI, and perhaps also IMEC, which has got stalled now, sort of because of that's the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, has got a little stalled because of the instability and the conflict going on. Is that what are the alternate routes out? And the EU and the US is looking at a Trans-Africa corridor presently that stretches, say, from Zambia on towards the eastern side of Africa onto the port of Lobito in Angola. So that's another option that nations can start looking at. And having said that, it's not part of the discussion, but India and Japan can be brought on board that Trans-Africa corridor, because we do have an AGC, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, with Japan, which has got stalled. So there are many initiatives that come about that support the issue of connectivity and economics and trade. And we need to look at them, whether it's under the rubric of APEC or whether it's under a certain other understanding. And I think when it comes to trade and connectivity, although it's an Asia-Pacific economic, forum, nothing stops it from looking the world over. Because globalization has taught us one thing, that your economies are global, and therefore, if you work together as APEC, you can actually have some sort of a, maritime connectivity global, which helps the overall aim of APEC. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that comments on that, Captain. I think we'll go ahead and leave just a couple of minutes for each person to give their concluding remarks, and then we'll go ahead and wrap with that. So if you want to make one highlight thing about your takeaway or how you want to summarize the conversation, please feel free. Beginning with you again, Colin.
I don't have anything else to add. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I really enjoyed hearing the views of the other panelists here today on the APEC US Summit. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Edmund, and thank you, Indu, and thank you, Colonel Homan and Saraji. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation and happy to share my perspective. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Nothing from my side, but it's been an enjoyable discussion. I think a lot of points have come out on the table, but India has to work harder to become an APEC member, and that's my final point.
Understood. Thank you all for taking the time to do this today. I know that you're in different time zones. From home at 3:30 in the morning. That's quite the commitment. So thank you all for being here, for taking time, and for sharing your perspectives with us. It's been a very informative conversation, and I really appreciate it. Susanna, you want to wrap us here?
Thank you, Edmund. And thank you, everyone, particularly Colonel Hallman and Dr. Yao with the odd time hours. And it was a very insightful discussion. And I believe that there are some more questions that are unanswered. And hopefully we will have another discussion of what Sarabjit and Dr. Yao mentioned, that I echo with the Colonel Holman, what he said, that yes, the United States needs to do more on the economy side, because when I was reading that that outcome of the APEC summit, that was what the amount figure says, that U.S. invested $50 billion to the APEC economies, while the APEC companies in the APEC countries, they invested $200 billion in the United States. And this is the figure that since Biden-Harris administrations. So I guess at the partner countries, they are looking towards the United States to do more on the side of the economic integration and the economic support. There are a lot of points that in the outcome document is there. And hopefully we will take on the next discussion on the APEC plus IPEF, or maybe we'll see that there is one in the future. Thank you, everyone.